She called me an ugly cow in French, and she thought I didn't understand. That was the moment everything changed. I'll never forget the way she smiled across my kitchen table that night. Thin gold ring on her finger, a little blue dress that looked freshly stitched, and the way she touched David's hand like it was the most precious thing in the room. I was 60, a widow of 7 years who had learned to make apple pie like my mother did, flaky crust, cinnamon just shy of too much, and I had been slowly building a quiet life around Sunday dinners and our old dog, Rufus. My son, David, had always been gentle in a way that made me worry and trust in equal measure. He was 35 then, a corporate architect with a serious laugh, the kind of man who cried at the end of sad films and knew the name of every plant in our yard. Camille arrived like a surprise summer storm. Her accent, soft, melodic, gave everything she said a lilt that made David grin like a schoolboy. She complimented my pie with an intensity I hadn't seen in a decade. She learned our family's small rituals in a week, passing the salad clockwise, putting the dessert plates on the left, asking about my roses. She told stories of Provence as if she had ducked into a postcard, lavender fields, small cafes, a grandmother who hummed chansons while stirring jam. Everyone fell for her. Even Rufus wagged at her boots. So when she took my phone from the counter to Snapchat a photo of David by the hearth, I thought nothing of it. We were laughing about a silly childhood story, the time he tried to build a treehouse and ended up with half a ladder and a lot of apologies, and Camille was leaning in, eyes hungry for the story, her hand brushing his sleeve as if she was collecting warmth. She stayed later than most guests. She kissed David goodbye with an almost theatrical tenderness and promised to bring a bottle of something from France for the next dinner. That next dinner is when I started to smell something out of place. We had the good china out because it felt like an occasion. I had made extra apples, and the bourbon in the pie had set just right. The house hummed. Conversation folded and reopened like a comfortable sweater. Camille talked about a design job she said she had in Marseille. She spoke of little things, a cousin who painted, a father who had been a schoolmaster, and her words were smooth as silk. When she laughed, she closed her eyes. David wore that grin that made his dimples rise up like small moons. I watched them and felt a mother's gratitude. My son happy. Someone who seemed to love him. At some point during the second course, David's phone rang. He put it on speaker because he expected it to be his sister with a joke. The ringtone was a soft chime. He stepped into the hallway, leaving his phone face up. I wasn't paying attention.
That is, until I heard her voice. Not the warm cadence she used with me, but a clipped, rushed whisper. And then words I understood like a stone dropping into a still pond. She said, plainly, "Salvache," and then laughed. She doesn't even know. She called me an ugly cow. She doesn't even know. The world narrowed. My fork clinked against my plate. Somewhere in the kitchen, the china made that thin, brittle sound it makes when you forget the oven is still hot. I don't remember moving to the hallway. I don't remember catching sight of the phone. What I remember is my heart beating loud enough to drown the sound of her breath. She thought I didn't understand French. She was wrong. I stood there, invisible, listening to a woman I had smiled at hours before discuss, in French, plans that sounded like a transaction. Mention of marriage, mention of a green card as if it were an object to be acquired, a quick calculation about money guarded behind words for inheritance and paper. The tone was casual, clinical. The voice I had liked turned small, sharp, efficient. She tossed out names like props and dates like deadlines. I remember one phrase that felt like an instruction. We do it before the holidays. We do it before the holidays. It landed like an order. I remember the sound of china hitting the floor and the way everyone in the kitchen turned toward the noise. Someone, I think David, came back into the room. The phone was still on speaker. The woman on the other end hadn't noticed the change. She continued talking, now in English, her accent thin and uncertain, saying something like, "Everything's in place." Her American voice was small and sharp in the way that didn't match the Camille I had been hearing. The voice called someone honey and used words like claim and file. My mouth went dry. I didn't shout. I didn't move to confront her. I sat down, because my knees needed something, and I watched the woman across the table laugh at a joke David told about a university professor. She said, "She'll never suspect a thing. She'll never suspect a thing." I could feel her glance at me and imagine the contempt there, the calculation. A country could be crossed with a glance when someone decided a person was simply background. What you don't see on the home movies is how a mother makes a decision when the people she loves are blind to the threat. Lovers make choices for each other every day. A mother makes choices in the time between your heartbeat and the next. I made mine then, not to explode, not to humiliate, not to demand answers on the spot. If I had, it might have been dismissed as jealous drama. If I had confronted her, I would have watched David defend his future like a man guarding a child's imagination. I wanted proof that would not be dismissed as paranoia. So I did what a woman who had run a household, balanced budgets, and negotiated bedtime boundaries does. I began to quietly gather facts.
First came the quiet nights at my kitchen table with my laptop and a glass of the wine left in the bottle. I had learned a little about online searching in the years since David left for college. I scrolled through what Camille had on social media. There were pictures in cafes, photos of a beach that could have been any Mediterranean shore, an engagement ring selfie with a caption that felt rehearsed. But the details were thin, nothing that tied the woman in our living room to the places she named with the specificity she delivered at dinner. Names of workplaces turned up empty. A supposed design firm had a skeleton website with a logo and a contact email that bounced. I am not proud of how my mind turned to small conspiracies, but then 10 years of life teaches you to notice patterns. Someone who curated persona without the messy paperwork to back it up is a little like a person building a house and skipping the foundation. I showed a few screenshots to Claire, my niece, who works in visa services at the State Department. Claire is practical in a way that makes her good at paperwork and bad at lies, the type who calls out a falsehood with the same gentle disgust she uses when finding a dead leaf in her salad. Check photos for metadata, Claire told me over the phone with clinical calm. Look for duplicates, reverse image search, and be careful, Aunt Mags. Don't do anything you might regret. Claire calls me Aunt Mags like she's trying to make me feel immortal. I did what she suggested. Reverse image searches turned up familiar faces in different places, images cropped and reused with different captions. One image that Camille used as if it proved a long-term life in Marseille also belonged in another listing to a travel blog from 3 years prior. The more I dug, the more the threads loosened. I hired Marcus Webb, a private investigator Claire recommended. Marcus is not the sort of man who appears in movies. He is ordinary in his build, a bit hunched like someone whose job is to scan the world for small contradictions, with hair the color of late winter and eyes that move like someone who has learned to read a room before he enters it. He charged less than I feared and arrived with a soft knock and a firm handshake. "You want evidence or do you want drama?" he asked on our first morning over coffee, which was his way of deciding whether we were allies or playthings. "Evidence," I said. The word felt like a vow. "And if I'm foolish, I will accept that too." Marcus started with what I had: phone numbers, passport photos, the few emails that corresponded to her supposed firm. He told me, people who build a life on fiction often repeat the same patterns. They'll use a story that has worked elsewhere, reuse a name, or worse, use someone else's name to make their version of truth more believable. He found small contradictions right away.
A supposed prior marriage certificate had a different hometown listed than documents tied to the woman's passport. The phone number was registered overseas, but relayed through a U.S. number that had short, sharp bursts of activity around the holidays. Marcus pulled public records, not the kind you need a warrant for, but the kind that a patient, licensed investigator can obtain. There were addresses that belonged to rented units, names attached to those addresses who were older and disconnected from the girl who had told stories of a schoolmaster father. He also found a reference to a name I'd never heard, Christina Marsh. It showed up, faint and clinical, on an application somewhere Marcus could access. Not legal trouble, but a paper trail that suggested a past of moving and reinvention. Marcus flagged it and said, "It's a breadcrumb. It doesn't tell us the kitchen or the table, but it tells us someone has been in the house." We tread carefully. Claire warned me that people who are deceptive will use any attention to cover tracks. Marcus advised methodical patience. We were not vigilantes. We were a mother and a professional following a trail of small evidences until it made a pattern. I felt every one of those pieces as if they pressed a finger into the bruise of my intuition. Each small mismatch, a photograph that was too polished, a contact that didn't answer, a job title with no company history, stacked into a rising sense of wrongness. I kept thinking of that phrase she used on the phone, the one that sliced open the domestic scene. She'll never suspect a thing. How easy it is to call a life a thing when you intend to use it. The deeper Marcus dug, the more a picture emerged of someone who had rehearsed intimacy. He sent me a careful list of anomalies, an email address used for 2 different names, a passport whose photo looked altered, a history of sudden relocations every few months, none of them long enough to build the social paper someone needs to be real. There were mentions in cryptic records of payments to service providers and wiring that suggested a pattern of moving money around in small increments. Marcus was clear. This was not violent. It was not the sort of thing that required immediate handcuffs. It was a pattern of deception, of performance. One night, Marcus called and said, "We've opened a new door." He had found a LinkedIn account, the kind people use to validate themselves, but it was thin and referenced a name David repeated in sleep, Camille Dubois. The profile, however, linked to another person's online footprint from France, someone who lived, worked, and had a real history. The more Marcus looked, the clearer the theft became. This person had taken someone else's life, stitching together a plausible little narrative from stolen pieces. I felt something break in me then, not like a resolution, but like a new, sharp clarity.
There was a real woman, a Camille Dubois, somewhere in France, living her life, perhaps oblivious that someone had folded her identity into a different orbit. The idea that an innocent person, somewhere, had their name pinned to someone else's deceit made my stomach sick. I was simultaneously furious and tender in a way that made no sense at all. Furious at the woman across my table, and tender for the woman whose identity had been used like a costume. Marcus suggested we approach this carefully. If the imposter, and I was loath to use the word until I had more than hunches, was operating on borrowed identity, she might have ties to people capable of manufacturing backstories, rented parents, actors for the part, a fake lease in the right neighborhood. That was when he suggested something I hadn't imagined: check the parents. People who pull these cons want to make it feel safe, he said. They'll go so far as to hire people to play safe. They will build a little theater to make others believe the play. I remember the night we invited David and Camille to a small get-together, not to entrap, but to gather the small, natural contradictions a casual dinner can reveal. I dusted off my grandmother's silver, boiled the Brussels sprouts until they smelled of burnt garlic, and then, mercifully not, and set out wine that had the kind of cork that opens with a long sigh. I asked David if we could invite his fiancée and her parents. He said, of course, like he had never doubted their existence. Camille told me by phone that her parents were coming from out of town and that they were very excited. She said in that warm voice, "They are traditional, but they adore David. They are traditional, but they adore David." They arrived a week later in a polished rental car and wearing the sorts of smiles actors are paid to deliver after reading a script. Henri and Margot, parents as introduced, were amiable in the way practiced people are amiable. Broad, careful tones, pauses placed exactly where sympathy was expected. They told the same little anecdotes about a childhood in a small town, a father who taught arithmetic the hard way, a mother who made jam in summer and could make a mean cocoa burr. Their accents were slightly off, not quite the breathy regional phrasing I had heard from Camille. I couldn't place it at first, only that their French sounded more like a school textbook than a home. There is a peculiar, subtle thing actors do. They fill silence with performance. A pause is a chance to catch light. They laugh when laughter is expected. They overcompensate in the small ways that make routine life feel staged. I watched David watch them, his chest puffed with a soft glow, like someone who had been given permission to believe in fairy tales. I felt proud, and my pride felt like a softened armor, vulnerable and heavy. At dinner, the conversation folded. Margot handed me a small bundle, a foreign cookie tucked into tissue like a peace offering. She said something about having made it herself, the accent light, the grammar proper. I felt a little prickle at the back of my neck. Henri offered a toast in French that felt practiced, too perfect. Their pictures on their family album were glossy, and the edges of the album were too clean. Marcus sent me what he had gathered the next morning. He had done what I had not. He had pulled background details and quietly confirmed that the couple who had attended, the parents, had backgrounds that did not match the story they told. They had moved often in the last few years, their names connected to small performance gigs, and worryingly to an agency that supplied extras for commercials. Marcus's note was short. They are not her parents. I felt the room tilt under me at that sentence. The phrase, not her parents, was a new key that opened another locked door. If they were actors, then someone had bought more than a ring. Someone had rented an entire family narrative. I will admit to the reader, and to myself, that what came next smelled of something I would later recognize as moral compromise. I arranged a quiet meeting with Claire and Marcus to decide the next steps. The options were blunt and few. Do nothing and hope it resolves, confront David and risk him dismissing me as a jealous mother, or gather evidence in a way that law enforcement would find credible. We ruled out anything that smacked of entrapment or illegality. We agreed to stay factual, to follow the paper trail, and to let professionals make arrests if warranted. Claire, whose day job made her careful about steps and procedures, suggested contacting the appropriate authorities if our evidence supported it. She used the word ICE in a clinical tone and reminded me, immigration enforcement isn't about nationality, it's about paperwork, and the theft of a real person's name is a serious thing. That sentence lodged in me like a splinter. I was not thinking in politics of borders. I was thinking of a woman across oceans who might wake up one morning to find her life had been borrowed by a stranger. I wanted her to be contacted, to be protected, and for the record to be set straight. Marcus kept digging. He obtained copies of rental agreements for the addresses Camille had used. He traced a pattern of short-term leases, pickup mail services, and a handful of wire transfers that suggested someone was paying for short bursts of illusion. He found a name, Christina Marsh, in an older application that popped up like a fossil a trowel had brushed free. Marcus did not overstate anything. He sent me the list of documents and told me plainly, there's something here that needs daylight. Throughout this slow gathering, David remained blissfully in love.
He would call to tell me about plans for a joint vacation to Provence, sketching floor plans for a little house he imagined they would buy. He talked about dates and flowers, about a December proposal he kept describing like it was a small, sacred thing he was planning to perform. He called me one night, breathless, and said, "She's perfect, Mom." I told him, because truth is the lattice on which relationships grow, that I liked Camille too, yes, but that I had been feeling a little uneasy on a few small things. He took it badly. He sounded protective, and for the first time since the phone call, I heard a crack in his trust in me. I did not want to push him away. I wanted to stop harm. That twofold pull, protect my son, not destroy his agency, is a tension mothers carry. We act like weather, steady and attempting to shelter. I promised myself I would proceed with caution, with facts, and with an eye toward minimizing public humiliation. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that truth is often sharp, and sometimes it cuts people you love. One night, Marcus called and asked, what if we had a night when everyone was in the same place? Parents, her, David, you. A meal where we could quietly observe what they say and collect any small clues that corroborate what we already suspect. He didn't use the word sting. He used the word observe. I chewed on that. I thought about the risk of doing anything that would turn into spectacle. I thought about how easy it is to turn righteous anger into something performative. I thought also about the phrase that had begun this. She'll never suspect a thing. I imagined the audacity it took for someone to plan an entire life built atop someone else's identity and to have the grace to call the woman whose kitchen she ate in a cow while thinking herself safe. When I looked at David's face the next evening, eating grilled cheese and soup in our small kitchen, I realized how much I was willing to do to keep him from becoming collateral damage. My hands trembled when I told him I was worried. He looked at me with a tenderness that turned to steel. "You're just scared, Mom," he said. "You always are." Maybe I am. I didn't argue. Instead, I told him I loved him and that I wanted to talk with him more. He nodded and went to bed early. The dog snored at the end of the hallway. The house smelled like lemon and apple. I went to sleep with the small, sharp knowledge of how close we sat to a precipice. The next morning, Marcus had already arranged contact with a lawyer who advised us on how to preserve evidence without breaking privacy laws, an important line Marcus insisted we not cross. Claire had drafted an email with steps to contact the State Department if it came to that, and she warned me about the collateral damage such action might cause to an innocent person whose identity had been used. The plan that formed was to document and then, if necessary, involve authorities who could handle matters in a way that minimized public spectacle. I invited Camille and her parents to another dinner under the pretext of celebrating David's promotion. I made the table intimate. Candles, the good silver again, my grandmother's lace runner. I watched them arrive, the parents moving like actors, their smiles polished. Camille hugged me long, and when she did, I felt, for a half-second, the warmth that had so easily deceived me. Marcus sat at a small table across from the living room, ostensibly there to fix the fuse for the chandelier if it flickered. He had agreed, for the sake of appearances, to be an unremarkable guest. Claire would be on standby on her phone, her messages short and urgent. We were a small, careful web of people trying to protect a family from an unraveling thread. Dinner went on with the easy chatter of practiced intimacy. Congratulations, compliments, a little too much interest in my pie recipe. At one point, Margot reached for my salt as if they were old friends. Henri told a joke that landed with a practiced laugh. I watched David watch them and felt an ache that was both preemptive and protective. Then, in the middle of coffee and a quiet discussion of holiday plans, I heard a tiny shift.
the kind of thing only a person looking for a small truth can hear. Margot, who had spoken French in a voice that sounded like a textbook, pronounced a word incorrectly. It was a minor tilt of the tongue, a vowel that sat in the wrong place, a clue that someone had learned the sounds and not the music. I felt a small, ruthless clarity cut my chest. Marcus tapped his spoon against his cup and gave me the smallest nod. We left that evening with more than lip-deep conviction. Marcus had enough to suggest that the parents had been hired hands and that the woman who called herself Camille had at least one falsehood in her paperwork. We had not yet sealed the case. We had not yet reached the place where an arrest could be made without risking the kind of public spectacle that destroys people without sorting truth. But we had crossed from intuition to evidence, and that was a dangerous, necessary place. When I washed the plates that night, my hands were steady, but my mind was not. I had a son who loved a woman whose past smelled of rehearsed lines. I had a pile of documents that suggest a life built on borrowed names. I had a private investigator, a Nisawa State Department, and a moral knot in my chest that tightened each time David looked at his phone with happiness. That is where I stopped at the edge of decision. We had proof that prodded at the facade, clues that suggested a theft of identity, and people who could and would take the next steps if necessary.
I stood with a sink full of suds, eyes stinging with dishwater and maybe with something else, and thought of the woman in France whose life might have been used in someone else's fabrication. I thought of David's face, bright and trusting, unaware that the very warmth he believed in might be constructed. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was gray with early winter. My breath fogged the glass. I knew the choice ahead of me would not be simple. To protect a son I adored, I might have to orchestrate a confrontation that would humiliate him in public, or I could risk letting him marry a stranger whose promises had the feel of counterfeit coins. I set down the sponge and wiped my hands on a towel. I had to choose, and I had to plan. That evening I called Marcus and told him to keep working. I told Claire to be ready if we needed to involve official channels. I told David vaguely that I had been feeling uneasy and that I loved him. He sounded distant on the phone, the way someone sounds before they sleep, and I felt the first small fissure of what would come next, the balance between truth and love, between protection and betrayal. Camille texted me a photo of a small bracelet she said she wanted to give David on their upcoming trip. Her fingers in the photo were manicured perfectly. The caption read, "Soon, mon amour. Soon, my love." I saved the message. I archived the photos. I told myself I was collecting the pieces of a puzzle, so that when the time came, the puzzle would not be dismissed as a mother's jealous fantasy. We were about to move from looking to acting. The plan, careful, legal, and designed to protect, began to take shape like a ship being readied at harbor. I did not yet know how it would land, what the cost would be, or whether David would ever forgive the methods we chose. I did know this. A woman had called me an ugly cow, thinking I did not understand, and understanding had brought me here, to the quiet edge of a decision I hoped would save him. If you're new here, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I read my comments and they keep me steady. The next days were a blur of small motions. Marcus worked his contacts. Claire ran background checks through official channels and reminded me of the ways identity theft can damage people who are already vulnerable. I learned to recognize the difference between the person who lies to survive and the person who plans a life built to deceive for gain. There was a moral line there that it felt dangerous to cross, even in my righteous rage. One afternoon, Marcus called and asked if I could host another dinner. Not a trap, he said, but an opportunity for a few more pieces to fall into place. He had found, he said, paperwork connected to a Christina Marsh. He asked if I wanted him to do anything overt. His voice was always steady, the voice of a man who had seen much and chose his steps. Just factual, I told him. We keep it factual. That night, as I set another table, I rehearsed the things I would say if David asked about my behavior. The words, "I love you," and "I am sorry if this hurts you," and "I will not act to humiliate you." Love, I thought, is the only honest currency in a mess like this. Evidence might buy us safety. Love was the language to hold when the evidence was delivered. Camille arrived with a small bouquet of flowers, their stems wrapped in paper. She handed them to me with a smile that now held something between calculated charm and practiced gentleness. She asked in that soft voice that had felt genuine for so long, "Does your son know about our plans?" I felt the room tilt. He did not.
I felt the question as if someone had asked whether I had noticed the cracks in the ceiling this whole time. The meal began like a play we had already seen, with lines we expected. Marcus sat in a chair that made him look like a harmless uncle. Claire texted me a single heart in between courses and then went quiet. I watched Camille pass the gravy, watched Henri and Margot nod in the right places. I watched David's face, and I thought how merciless it would be to take his joy from him without cause. During dessert, I asked Camille, calmly, where her diploma was from. She answered easily, the words smooth. Marcus's hand tapped his cup under the table. She then referred casually to a set of dates that did not align, a year off here, a claim of a show she had performed in a town that did not check out. David's brow furrowed, the first tiny crease of worry I had seen in weeks. I reached for his hand and squeezed it. He looked at me with concern that I did not want to deepen. I decided then I would not act as judge or jury. I would continue to collect what we needed to present, if necessary, to those whose job it was to act without spectacle. But I also decided that if there was a stolen life somewhere, a real Camille who deserved to be known, I would find her. No one gets their name stolen without consequence. No one should wake up to find strangers living on the currency of their identity. We left that night with more questions than answers, but with a new, quietly confirmed suspicion. The people who had claimed to be parents had no family ties that matched their story. The woman who called herself Camille had paper that bent under pressure. Marcus's last words as he reached for his coat were, "We have enough to keep going." That is where this part of the story stops, at the moment when suspicion became something that could be laid on a table and examined. We had evidence that smeared the sheen off a polished story. We had allies. We had a son who loved blindly. We had, most painfully, a real human being somewhere whose name might have been stolen for advantage. I sat at my kitchen table that night and thought about how fragile identity can be, how easily a life can be folded into someone else's script, and how much courage it takes to insist on truth when the person you love might be hurt by it. I did not yet know how we would bring the pieces into the light without destroying the person I loved. I only knew I could not go back to pretending nothing had happened. The decision to move forward would be deliberate, not rash, not cruel, but it would carry consequences. I washed the plates, set them on the rack, and walked to my room with the quiet ache of someone about to do what they hope will save what matters most. I will tell you what happened next, the steps we took, the points where things broke, and the way the truth finally showed itself. But first, I want to hear from you. Has anyone ever had to choose between protecting a loved one and telling a difficult truth? Share in the comments below. Your stories matter to me. The plan that formed felt ridiculous to my polite lemon and apple-scented life. It also felt inevitable. We decided on Christmas Eve. David had been planning to ask Camille to marry him in December. He'd rehearsed it like a private play. He wanted candles and an old song on the radio, and for Rufus to be wearing a ridiculous bow tie. The thought of him, ring in pocket, ready to stand in my living room and promise a future to a woman who might be living someone else's life, made me ache in a way I had trouble naming. Marcus, Claire, and I talked through every detail until the plan felt as careful as a rosary. Gather more witnesses, preserve paper trails, have law enforcement present but unobtrusive, prepare for the emotional fallout. We were not setting a snare. We were making sure that if the line between performance and crime existed, someone trained to handle that line would be there to step across it. Claire used her channels to consult quietly, to make sure we avoided the very thing that had kept me frozen the first night, an easy dismissal by a jury of family feelings. Marcus arranged for a few more background checks and for the parents to be under discreet surveillance. I wrote versions of what I might say and then crumpled them up. Words felt dangerous in those days. I carried the weight of the plan into the same kitchen that had once felt like a sanctuary. I baked another pie because comfort is a thing you can feed people when you cannot fix anything else. The house glowed with lights. I put the good silver on the table and thought about how adult life offers no manual for distinguishing between love and con artistry. You can only act in the small moral theater you inherit. The same hands that taught the family to pass salad clockwise now had to decide how to protect a son. On the afternoon of the dinner, David called. He was humming, and I could hear the nervousness threaded through the song. "Do you think she'll love the ring?" he asked.
His voice was quiet, like a man who had been given hope and didn't want to squander it. "Yes," I said, and it was the first honest thing I had said about a lot of people lately. "I do."
He told me he had planned to get down on one knee after dessert, when the tree lights would be soft and Rufus would be asleep. He sounded pleased and a little scared, and I told him to come by early so we could put the pie in the oven and so I could get a moment with him before the evening began. I did not tell him about the phone calls, or Claire, or Marcus, or the way a woman's voice had turned small and transactional on my kitchen speaker months before. He arrived, washed his hands like a boy, and hugged me. I felt a pressure in my chest that was part hope, part dread. He was 37 now, and there's a point where a mother keeps hoping to be useful, to find ways to make the world softer for a child who has already grown into a man. I wanted to do that without smothering him with fear. Guests arrived, friends, neighbors who had become like family, a woman from church who brought a green bean casserole. Someone I had never met before sat at the end of the table and introduced herself as Sarah. She had the soft, efficient composure of someone who had learned to move through public rooms without making them her stage. Marcus sat in a corner with a notebook disguised as a prop. Claire tucked messages into her phone between courses. Henry and Margot arrived exactly on cue, smiling in the way practice people do. Camille came in a blue dress she had worn before, hair soft around her face, and she hugged David like Shoreline's meeting. The dinner had the shimmer of all good family evenings. Plates passed, a joke too long though it landed anyway, the rustle of wrapping paper at the floor. David reached for the ring at the start of dessert. His hands trembled in a way that was achingly familiar to me. My son, nervous and earnest. He slid the box into his pocket and mouthed to me that he was ready. I nodded, because what else could a mother do but signal she loved you and believed in the moment you had been preparing? That is why the moment the room changed hit with the force of betrayal. It was quiet at first. Henry made a clumsily polite remark about how cold the season had been, and then the woman at the end of the table, Camille, answered in a voice that had the clipped efficiency I had heard on the phone months before. She leaned forward and said a thing that, even now, I can hear like the break of glass in a quiet room. She referred to the file, as if the life she was proposing to enter were a folder of papers and instructions. She pronounced a name, Christina, and then almost under her breath, switched accent. "You don't know, do you?" she said then, in a voice that stripped the silk from the accents and left a small, hard sound. It wasn't theatrical. It was a practical voice, the kind that wends through paperwork. The air in the room shifted. Marcus stood. Claire's hands tightened around her phone. The woman near us, the guest who had introduced herself as Sarah, reached into her purse and unfolded a card. She stood and said, plainly, "I am Special Agent Sarah Chen with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement." She said it with the kind of calm that makes noises like a small bell in a silent church. She explained, in a voice that was professional and not unkind, that there were questions about identity theft and immigration documentation, and that for the protection of everyone present, she needed to ask a few questions. Humiliation is a strange weather. For a few seconds, the room contracted into the small space of David's face, the flush rising, the way his eyes widened, the way a hand reached into his pocket for a ring and then withdrew it trembling. The ring fell to the floor and landed with a tiny metallic cry, rolling like a small world that had been nudged off its map. I remember the sound like a bell, because sound tends toward the symbolic when your heart is breaking. Camille, Christina, met the agent's calm with a crispness instead of panic. Her voice shifted back to that earlier, quick cadence when she spoke. She didn't scream. She didn't break into tears. She gave a small, tired smile that had the interesting quality of someone accustomed to changing faces as the mood demanded. When Agent Chen read a few questions about names and dates, the woman answered. Her answers hopped across stories like stepping stones over water, plausible, practiced, slippery. At one point, the woman laughed, quietly, without joy, and said, "You'll see, it all makes sense." Then, in a single moment that pinned everyone to the room, she dropped the name she had been using. "Christina Marsh," she said. It was as if she had removed a mask and left a stub of a name behind. "My name is Christina Marsh," she said, in a thin American accent. That was the moment the other mask came off. I will not pretend that the scene that followed was cinematic in any tidy way. Agent Chen did not shout. She did not perform. She collected papers, explained rights, and said that questions would be asked. For David, the world telescoped into a sequence of shocks. The ring on the floor, the person he wanted to marry now on the other side of an investigation, and his mother, who had sat and watched, and then helped orchestrate a presence that had emptied the room of its illusions. He looked at me with something that felt like an animal measuring a trap. It was a look I had no defense for. "Why did you—" he said, but his voice broke into a dozen fragments and fell silent. "What did you expect me to do?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to say that I had listened, and then I had gathered facts, and that I had not wanted to be the mother who ruined her son's hope with mere suspicion. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry.
which is both the easiest and the most ruinous thing to say in a room that needs answers.
Christina, Camille's imposter, was led from the house with a measured efficiency. She did not cry. She did not beg. Marcus quietly passed the agent a packet of items we had collected: the bounced emails, the rental agreements, the thin resume stitched with dates that did not line up. Agent Shen thanked us and said the case would be documented. She was calm, exact, and made no promises about outcomes. She said something I have disremembered in detail, because promises in those hours were of little use to a family on the edge of its own implosion. David's gaze returned to me like a small animal returning to the place it is wounded. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "How could you," he said, and this time the words had shape. "How could you do this to me? To us?" The sentence was not only accusation, it was grief. He left the house in a manner that made the deadest echo: the slam of the front door, the crunch of gravel under his tires, the absence of a phone call, the absence of immediate reciprocation. I watched his SUV drive away, and the feeling in my chest was something akin to a fissure that keeps widening. Marcus put a hand on my shoulder like the world had handed him rope that he hoped to use as a lifeline. Claire's messages began to come in sharp lines. "Give him space," she wrote. "This is traumatic. He will need to process." There is no neat way to describe what followed. Arrest is a legal event, but the emotional fallout is domestic, an architecture of pain, trust ruptured like old plaster. For weeks, David was not speaking to me. He took a leave from work and stayed with a friend. He called once and asked me not to come to his temporary apartment, as if my presence might lampoon his privacy. I respected it in form, but not in heart. I called and left messages that were less about defending myself than about saying I was sorry he had been hurt. I did not always hear back. People offered opinions in a kind of tidal wave. Some praised the action, others were more skeptical. The voice of the town church lady who had brought the green bean casserole rang in my ears with an odd mixture of sympathy and estrangement. Even my own friends, women who had known me since our jeans were bell-bottomed, had opinions. "You did what you had to do," one said. Another, softer, said, "You did the heart thing, Mags, but remember that heart things sometimes break people too." I slept badly. I made tea at 3 a.m. and thought about how easily truth can become a thing that injures people we love. Christina, who had been using the name Camille, was booked. She was processed. That is as far as I will describe the legal side, because it is not mine to narrate in detail, and the law is a thing of procedure rather than moral texture.
What mattered to me then was the human cost, and the fact that in the course of processing, someone who had been a stranger and a con had said something that changed the equation of our grief. She admitted she had been using someone else's identity. The admission was like a pin pricked into a balloon. When she said it, when she said that the name she used was not hers, that was the first time the narrative of the real Camille entered our consciousness, not as an idea, but as a person who had been harmed. She existed, Christina said, almost offhand, as if pulling a rabbit from a hat. The real Camille is in France. The name is hers. I used it. The words were unadorned, and yet they sank into the room like a stone. For the first time, my fury at the person across my table was fused with worry for someone I had never met. Marcus, in the days after the arrest, shifted roles from investigator to finder of real people. He tracked down digital breadcrumbs that led to a woman with the name Camille Dubois living in the south of France. Claire used her contacts at the State Department to ask for help in contacting her directly and to facilitate a way for us to speak with her without turning her life into a spectacle. We were careful, slow, and profoundly aware that we were reaching across an ocean to someone whose life might have been quietly complicated already by the theft of her name. When I finally spoke with the real Camille for the first time over a shaky international line, she sounded very small and very human. She said her name with a soft accent, Camille Dubois, and then she laughed in a way that was more a rueful exhale than anything. "My name?" she said. And then, "You mean someone used my name?" Her voice held astonishment at first, and then something like boned wariness. She told me she lived in a small town outside Marseille, that she was a teacher, and that she had heard of identity theft before, but had never imagined it would happen in such a personal, intimate way. She said she had no idea someone across the ocean had eaten pie in her name. She agreed, with a caution that felt like dignified fear, to speak with us and to come if necessary. Claire worked the channels to secure travel documents and to arrange for a safe visit. We spoke about how to bring her in with care, how to minimize exposure and to keep the center of the story on the harm she had suffered. It felt at once like a relief and new worry. relief that a real person existed whose life could be used to untangle the lie, worry that we were now importing another human being into an already traumatized household. When Camille arrived in Austin, she carried a small suitcase and a large reserve of politeness. She looked like someone who tended gardens and children, with hands that had been used for patient tasks. She hugged me once and then again, like someone who was measuring what trust could be rebuilt.
We met in my kitchen, the same place where the insult had landed and the plan had been born. The table, worn from years of Sunday dinners, felt like a witness to 1,000 small human reckonings. I poured coffee, as if one more ritual might stitch the world back together. Camille spoke of her life with a kind of gentle clarity. She showed me pictures on her phone of a small apartment with sun through the windows, of a classroom of bright-eyed children, of a mother who had once taught her to make jam. Her name, she said, had value because it tied her to people and to a history. To have it used by someone else, she said, was like being told I had a twin who stole my life. The phrase was both apt and crushing. There was dignity in her quietness. There was hurt in the way she kept glancing at the window, as if the idea of her name in the hands of a stranger had created a wind that might come for her. David, at first, could not look at her. He had been through enough to feel a rawness where before there had been only anticipation. He avoided the kitchen for days, then weeks. When he did come by, he stood in the doorway, like a man who had not yet decided whether to enter a room he had once imagined as his own. We did not push him. We gave him space in the particular form that Claire and Marcus advised: consistent, non-intrusive, present. Slowly, small things happened that shifted the axis of what had been broken. David met with the real Camille in my living room one afternoon. They sat across from each other with coffee steaming between them, and the first real conversation they had was awkward, and then very slowly, human. Camille apologized for the way her name had been used, which was bizarre, because she had done nothing wrong. David listened. He told her of his love and of his confusion, and of the way he had felt turned into an exhibit. He told her that he had been humiliated and embarrassed, and that the image of himself as a fool weighed heavily on him. Camille listened without flinching. She did not make herself the center of a story that had hurt someone else. She simply offered a kind of soft understanding. "Names are not like clothes," she said, half in French, which I translate here. "They are not something you can wear for a while and then leave in a drawer. Names are not like clothes. You cannot wear them a while and then leave them in a drawer." Her voice had a calmness that began to do what no document had yet managed. It humanized the abstract concept of identity theft. David's anger did not disappear overnight. It took months. There were nights I sat up and listened to the house and wondered if I had done the right thing. He texted me with long gaps between messages. He came for dinner and left early. He visited sometimes and returned less sometimes. The space between us was as real as any physical distance. There were moments, small, ordinary, that dictated the shape of repair. A shared joke about the dog, an apology that was not theatrical, but simple, an honest conversation where he told me the things that had scabbed over his heart. He said that my secrecy had felt like betrayal, that the sting of deception had been doubled by the way I had moved without him. I did not argue. I listened, and when it felt like the right thing to do, I said I was sorry. I said that my instinct had been to protect, not to control, and that I had misread the cost of my actions. In the slow aftermath, there were practical things to do. Claire worked with officials to ensure that the real Camille was not only safe, but able to clear her name where necessary. Marcus worked with attorneys to put together a chronology that could be useful if the state decided to pursue formal identity theft charges. I attended meetings where legalese blurred into moral language, and I learned again how words like evidence can both clarify and dehumanize. We did not seek to punish with showmanship. We sought to correct a wrong and to make sure that the woman whose name had been used could reclaim the record attached to it. There was also the quiet work of human reknitting. David started to see, through conversations and time, that the woman across from him, the real Camille, was not a prop. He watched her in the small, unromantic spaces of daily life and found himself moved by the way she tended to the small things: a plant in a window, a cracked teacup, a child's misplaced mitten. He began to laugh in a way that was not perfunctory. He began to trust himself to feel again. Months after the arrest, when the dust had settled enough that it felt safe to plan a trip, David asked if I would come to Provence with them. not to interfere. He said that plainly. I want you there because you're my mother, he said, because you were there when this went wrong, and I need you there when we see how it could be right. It was the first time in a long time that he had not sounded like an animal guarding a trap, but like a man reaching for repair. I went. Provence is a place words try to hold on to, and always fall short of. Lavender fields roll against a sky that has the kind of quality you own a postcard for, but never truly possess. The town where Camille grew up had cobbled streets, and a church bell that told the hours. It smelled of baked bread and simmered tomatoes, and the wet earth after rain. David walked those streets like a man discovering a place that matched the lines he had drawn in his head about a life he wanted to build. He walked with his hands in his pockets and a quiet that looked like peace. We met Camille's mother. She was diminutive and sharp-eyed, with hands that had made jam for years.
She welcomed me like a long-lost sister, and when she hugged me, there was an odd precision. Two women who had been involved in the same mess, both with a sweetness that recognized the particular bruises of motherhood. There were long dinners with far too much cheese, and nights when David and Camille would walk home with their arms woven, and my chest would ache in a way that felt like gratitude and humility braided together. The wedding was small. It was at a stone chapel with ivy crawling up the walls. People stood in a circle and watched two people stitch together a plan that had been nearly derailed. David and Camille spoke vows that were not all fireworks, but were earnest and small, and made of the particular craft of promises. I will be honest, I will listen, I will not assume. Their hands met and their faces shone, and when they leaned in, the world around them blurred into a gentle hum. A friend of mine took a picture and texted it to me later with a heart. I kept it in my purse for months. There were moments, private, difficult, that I will not air like a sermon. There was the night before the wedding when David came to me and said quietly, I forgive you, but I do not understand it all yet. It was not a clean forgiveness. It was layered and messy and real. I told him I understood. I asked for his help in learning how to be a better mother in a world that had become a place where identities could be stolen like coats. He nodded and seemed to accept that the work of trust would be ongoing. What I learned in the years after is that truth can demand a high price. Exposing Christina saved my son from a life built on performance, and yet the exposure hurt him in ways I had not fully anticipated. The moral calculus was not zero-sum. It was complicated. Had I done nothing, he might have married a woman who was lying. Had I done everything differently, I might have avoided the raw public humiliation that came with an arrest at our table. There is no neat moral calculus for those landscapes. There is only the reality that a mother will sometimes act to protect, and that those acts carry consequences. There is also the small, luminous joy of redemption. The real Camille did not become a plot device in our story. She became a friend. She came to our house many times after the wedding. Rufus learned to accept her as someone who offered him treats with the same gentleness she offered our son. She and I made jam together on a slow Saturday, stirring sugar and fruit as people do when they want to make something preservable out of a season. When she left to return to France, she hugged me like someone who had been given back a name that had been used like a costume. Her life, once tangled in another's fiction, became increasingly hers again. Did David and I lose something in the process? Yes. There are things you cannot put back into place like a knocked-over vase. Trust is one such thing. It is fragile and mends slowly. But I learned, too, that being honest about the ways you err is part of the repair. I had to say, often and plainly, I was protecting you. I was wrong about how to do it sometimes. I am sorry for the humiliation and for the way secrecy made you feel like someone whose agency had been taken without consent. When people ask me now whether I would do it again, I am honest in a way that is perhaps unsatisfactory to those who want a simple parable. I say, I would act to protect my son from deception. I would gather facts and avoid spectacle. But I would also try harder to keep him part of the process, because the secrecy that once felt necessary also made him into a collateral casualty in the way the arrest unfolded. I would try to do the moral work with him, not for him, because even protective acts can become a betrayal when they are done without the person they are meant to save. There are lessons if one is willing to learn them. One is that identity can be stolen not only in paperwork, but in people's imaginations, where a story repeated becomes more real than an actual person. Another is that when you are the parent of an adult, your role shifts from protector to ally in a different way. You have to remember to ask permission to act. That is not always possible in every situation, but it is a principle worth trying to honor. Finally, it is worth saying that the systems we relied on, an investigator who worked patiently, Claire's knowledge of the right channels, Agent Chen's professional handling, were not infallible, but they were necessary. They were the kinds of tools we would have needed to use whether we liked it or not. I do not tell this story to revel in the downfall of someone who hurt us. Even Christina, who used the name of another woman, was in the end a complicated human being who made choices that hurt others. There is no justice in gloating over suffering. The real justice, as limited as human systems allow, was in giving the truth a chance to be documented and in helping the woman whose name had been stolen to reclaim it. If there is a final thing I can offer as a mother who has had to do the hard arithmetic of protection and apology, it is this. Act with diligence, yes, but also with love that admits its flaws. Let the people you love have a part in the decisions that will affect them, and when they are hurt by your choices, listen harder than you explain. Forgiveness will come at its own pace. Do not rush it. Offer it, and accept that rebuilding trust is a patient, daily work. When David called from Provence after the wedding and said simply, "We wanted you here because of everything you did, even the things that were messy," I had to sit down. I told him that I loved him and that I was sorry for the hurt my choices had caused. He laughed, a small, honest sound, and said, "We know you loved us, Mom." It was not a tidy reconciliation. It was a beginning, a continuous tending.
The table we ate at now bears new scratches, testifying to a family that has been through things and is still here. Rufus is gone now. Old dogs go first. And sometimes when I set the table, I think about the fragility of our lives and how easily a phrase dropped in a language you do not think you understand can roll into something that changes everything. "Salvash," she had said, thinking I didn't understand. She was wrong. The phrase did not simply sting. It started a chain of events that revealed an ugly plan and brought a real person into our orbit who deserved restitution. If you've ever had to decide between protecting someone you love and telling a hard truth, you know the shape of the question I am still asking myself. It does not have an answer that fits in a neat paragraph. It has an answer that lives in the days you choose to repair, the conversations you refuse to dodge, and the ways you hold people accountable while trying not to crush them. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please subscribe and share your own experiences in the comments. I read them, and they mean a great deal.